In this mini lesson, we'll be practicing factoring by grouping. Your biggest hint when you need to know that you need to group something in order to factor it is if there are 4 terms. Anytime that you see 4 terms in your polynomial, you need to look to factor by grouping before you look for anything else. Obviously, the first thing you look to take out is the GCF, and then you want to factor by grouping. GCF is always the first thing that you look to do. So if we look at our first example, 8p cubed minus 24p squared plus 3pq minus 9q. I think about 8. 8 is 1 times 8, 2 times 4. And I see that none of those numbers are going to go into 3 or 9. So I know that there is no number that is a GCF. And I look through and I have 3 p's, 2 p's, 1 p, but this last term doesn't have a p, and the first term does not have a q, and neither does the second. So I know that there is no GCF in this particular case. So my first choice of what I'm going to try is I'm going to group the first 2 and the last 2. And I'm going to treat them as though they're individual binomials. I hope that this works out, but you can always group it in any way possible, whether you group the first and the last together, or even the middle 2 together, or the first and the third. It does not have to be the first 2, last 2, but this is the easiest one to try first. In this group, this binomial right here, I know that 8 can come out of both terms, and I see that I can take a p squared out of both terms. That would leave me with a p minus 3. I'm going to look at the second term. I cannot forget to write down my plus sign that's in my problem. It does not go away. I know that a 3 comes out of both 3 and 9, and I see that both terms have a q. So when I factor that out, I'm left with just a p from that first part of there when I factored out the 3q minus 3. Now here's what I really want you to see, is in this first part, once I factored, I was left with a p minus 3 inside the parentheses, and in the second part I was also left with a p minus 3 in the parentheses. If you look at your problem and you see that you've got the same thing inside of both sets of parentheses, you know that you're doing it right. Now if we look, the p minus 3's, the sets of parentheses, those are our new common term. That's our GCF. So we pull out what was in common, which happens to be what was inside the parentheses, and we write down what was left, 8p squared plus 3q. This is now my factored form. Moving on to our next example, I'm going to go ahead and set my problem up by setting my parentheses around my first 2 and my last 2. Again, it does not have to be grouped this way. But one thing I want you to pay very close attention to, and this is a very common mistake for people to make, is that you need to make sure that you realize that when there is a subtraction sign in the problem, you're not changing the entire problem. Because you put the sets of parentheses in there, this subtraction now gets to be foiled into that second binomial. The original problem had a positive 42a, but the foiling of this is going to make it a negative 42a. So in order to make sure that we don't change the problem, we need to change that second sign. So here's our little note to self. If there is a subtraction sign between the two binomials, change the second sign. And that will ensure that you're not changing the problem, you're just changing the way that it looks. So I'm going to go ahead and factor out a 6a squared from that first binomial. That's going to leave me with an a minus 3. I keep my subtraction sign. I know that 14 goes into 42, so I'm going to pull out a 14. I also see that both the terms have an a in it, so I'm pulling out a 14a. That's leaving me with an a minus 3. And again, what we notice is that whatever was in our sets of parentheses is exactly the same, and that is our goal. So I'm going to factor out what's the same, which is a minus 3, and I'm going to write down what's left over, 6a squared minus 14a. But here's our biggest problem. Look at this guy. We did not look for our GCF in the original problem, so this is actually a wrong answer because we did not pull out the GCF right away. But we can do it now because I noticed that there is a GCF. So our GCF, looking here, I can see that I can pull out a 2 and an A. And if I look up at the top, I could have pulled out a 2A from there, from here, as well as from here. Our GCF should have been 2A. I'm pulling 2A out of this binomial. That's going to leave me with a 3A minus 7, and I still have my A minus 3. Now in this case it was an easy fix to make, but please make sure that you always look for your GCF first. It's not always that easy to fix your mistakes. GCF is always the very first thing that you look for to take out of any time that you are supposed to be doing any type of factoring.